Well, hi everyone. My name is Kate Hohl. I'm the host of the MWA-New Crime Craft, and today I am so excited. We have the incredible historical thriller writer, Wanda M. Morris. Wanda, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to read Wanda's biography for everybody. Wanda M. Morris is the acclaimed author of several legal thrillers, including All Her Little Secrets, Anywhere You Run, and What You Leave Behind. Her books have been reviewed by the Boston Globe, LA Times, New York Times, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Seattle Times, and South Florida Sun-Sentinel, among others. Her debut novel, All Her Little Secrets, has been optioned for a limited series starring and executive produced by three-time Emmy winner Uzo Aduba, with Wanda serving as an executive producer. Her second book, Anywhere You Run, was named one of the top 10 crime fiction books of 2022 by the New York Times. It was named one of the best books of 2022 by NPR, Publishers Weekly, and Amazon. It was also listed as one of the 15 standout historical fiction books to read this year by Oprah Daily. Anywhere You won the 2023 Lefty Award for Best Historical Novel, the 2023 Georgia Author of the Year Award for Best Mystery, and the 2023 Anthony Award for Best Historical Novel. Anywhere You Run was also longlisted for the prestigious Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Prize. Wanda's latest book, What You Leave Behind, has also received stellar acclaim. It was named a top 100 best books of 2024 by Amazon editors and has been featured in People magazine, Us Weekly, The Washington Post, The Denver Post, The Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. What You Leave Behind was recently nominated for a 2025 NAACP Image Award in the category of Outstanding Literary Work Fiction. Wanda is a former corporate lawyer and now writes full-time. She is married, the mother of three, and lives in Atlanta, Georgia. Well, that was very thrilling for me to read that because that is that is that is Wanda in a nutshell. That's incredible. So welcome, Wanda.
Oh, thank you so much, Kate. And thank you all for having me today. As I was telling Kate before we got started, it is always so good for me when I am talking to fellow writers, and particularly writers like Kate, who I was in the trenches with when we were doing writing workshops together. And so thank you for this lovely invitation, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you guys. So I understand that you all have taken time out of your busy days to come and listen to me dribble on about historical fiction, which happens to be one of my favorite genres. When I set out to write my first book, of course, was contemporary, present day set. And so my after I turned that book in to my editor, um, she, called me up and she said, "So what do you want to write about next? Are you going to do, All Her Little Secrets part two?" And I was like, "No, I have this idea to write this book about two sisters who are on the run out of the Jim Crow South, 1964. And it's gonna be a thriller." And she kind of breathes this deep sigh and she goes, And I was like, "Oh, just trust me, it'll be okay, I think." But it all turned out well. And one of the reasons why I was inclined to write this particular book, and a historical book at that, is because we had just come through a tumultuous time after the 2020 election. I write from Atlanta, Georgia, as Kate mentioned. And during that election, there was lots of voter suppression going on here in Georgia. And I felt like I thought we had kind of um, conquered some of the issues that, I saw all around me. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And here we are 60 years later and still grappling with some of the same issues, not to mention some of the other isms that we deal with in daily life, racism, sexism, um, all the things. And so I really felt compelled to write about those issues. And so that is what became Anywhere You Run. So I'm going to share my screen. So give me a moment. All right, can everyone see that? Great. All right. And then let me just kind of flatten you guys out. So the for me, um, for me, I always try and start out not only with a good storyline, but I also want to start with characters. So, because I strongly believe that to hold someone's attention for 300, 400 pages, and ask somebody to spend $20, $30 for a book, um, you need to give readers something to kind of sink into. And for me, I've always believed that that was characters. And so that is kind of what I centered this book around. Um, just kind of quick background. Anywhere You Run, if you haven't read it, it's the story of two sisters, Violet and Marigold. So Violet, they both are raised in Jackson, Mississippi, and the time period is 1964. And Violet has suffered a brutal attack. She's been raped by a white man and local townsman, and she kills her attacker. No spoiler. That's not a spoiler because you kind of find that out in the first few pages. But she knows that as a Black woman, she's not going to get justice in the Jim Crow South. So she takes off running. When the police show up at her sister's door looking for Violet, her sister's Marigold, when the police show up at her door looking for Violet, she gets very, very worried because Marigold is also in a bit of trouble as well. She is pregnant and unmarried, which is a big no-no in, a big no-no for good girls in the 60s. And so she decides that the police have kind of, zeroed in on her. She decides to take off running as well. What the two sisters don't realize, however, is that there is a very dangerous man who knows about the murder that Violet has committed, and he is hot on their trail to find them, and he has a very unusual motive for doing that. So that's kind of the premise of the story. As I said, it takes place in 1964. So for me, I always like to say that here is where my informal research for the book began. Obviously, I was not a walking, talking adult in 1964, but I grew up hearing the stories of my parents. Those are my parents, Mabel and Herman Morrison. This picture was taken in the early 1950s. Before I was born, you can tell because they look happy and seem to be enjoying themselves. So, they both were born and raised in the Jim Crow South. My mom and dad are both from, my mom is originally from Tennessee, and then her family, when she was 4 years old, her family moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and my dad is from Talladega, Alabama. Excuse me. And so I grew up listening to their stories. Um, some of them were really horrific, but the story that always resonated the most with me is that they could not vote. They could not vote when they lived in Alabama. And so I am the youngest of seven kids, and I was actually born in Ohio. But in the late 50s, they decided they had had enough. And they packed up and moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and became part of the Great Negro Migration that moved out of the South and headed north. But their biggest issue was that they did not have a voice in the South. And I grew up hearing those stories. Now, my more formal research for this book took place here. This is the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American History and Culture, located right here in Atlanta, Georgia. And it is one of seven, I believe, libraries that are solely dedicated to African American history and culture and research. I remember once I had this idea that I wanted to write this book, I walked into this library and it was kind of one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. And so I walked up to the librarian and I told him, hey, I want to find out, more about this particular topic. And I taught him, kind of, voting rights and some other things. And, he smiled at me and he says, I got you. And he kind of opened up this panoply of materials, books and archives and papers and all sorts of things that almost made my head explode. I was just kind of like, whoa. But I just had access to all these materials. I am a book lady. I love, 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 love books, not only to write them, but to read them as well. And so I focused in addition to the materials that this particular librarian shared with me, I focused in on these three books in particular. We Are Not Afraid was written by Seth Kagan and Philip Dre, and they were two reporters, and if memory serves me correctly, I believe they worked for the New York Times, and they wrote the story of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. If you're not familiar with that story, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were three young men, college students, who were recruited to go into the South, into Mississippi in particular, as part of the summer project, summer, excuse me, summer project initiative in Mississippi, which was designed by several civil rights organizations, SNCC, SCLC, NAACP, had the idea for this initiative to gather college students, bring them into Mississippi, and go out into the city as well, most particularly the rural areas of Mississippi, and work with Black people to help them file applications to vote, because you had to go to the clerk, the county clerk, and fill out an application. And it was there during that process that a lot of Blacks faced things like IQ tests and all sorts of barriers to prevent them from voting. So these three young men go into Mississippi and they are murdered. And we'll talk a little more about this in the following slides to come up. I also had a character in the book who worked as a domestic, as a maid in the South. And I grew up, my grandmother was a maid in the South, in Alabama. My mother worked as a domestic for, she says, about 2 weeks and a day. And she said, that was not for me. And so she quickly hauled tail out of there and she got another job. But I needed to know, because my thing, if you're going to write historical, you want to make it as authentic as possible. So I needed to know, what was it like to work as a maid in the South. Jackson was a really good book that I relied on. This one was written by Calvin Trillin, also another journalist. And he had been specifically dispatched into Jackson, Mississippi for the entire year of 1964. And I believe it was shortly after Medgar Evers was killed, maybe the year before, but he had been specifically tasked with going throughout Jackson and talking to people and kind of getting insight. And so he would write these series of articles that were in the New Yorker. He was a reporter for the New Yorker. And so this is a book that compiles those articles. And so they were really, really useful to my research. So here's a little more detail on some of the research that I found. As I mentioned, the Initiative Summer Project initiative, Summer Freedom Project initiative, went to college campuses and actively recruited college students, Black and white, to go down to Mississippi. And here you see a picture. This comes from one of the archives at the library, where a couple young college students are explaining to this couple in rural Mississippi kind of what the process is and how they will help them vote. Now, many times, a lot of people were scared because they knew if they went in to try and vote that, their houses would be bombed or burned, that, they would lose their jobs and things like that. And so this was a really tender process for some of these students to try and coerce these people, and coerce is the wrong word, but kind of, you know, convince them that filing these applications to vote was the right thing to do. Here are a few more pictures where you see them training the students. The students were actually brought in as part of the initiative, and they were trained in nonviolent means, of course, but also just in how to go into these communities, because a lot of times, the local townspeople, particularly ones who were staunch segregationists, didn't want them there. And so they were taught, how to stay safe, how to stay in groups. Many times they wound up living with some of the families that they were trying to help to get the right to vote. And so these are some photos from the training. So, as you can see from these pictures, the Summer Freedom Project wasn't going so smoothly. People were, beaten, and the picture down below in the right-hand corner is a Greyhound bus that was bombed. These were the Freedom Riders that were going into the South, and someone threw a Molotov cocktail into the bus. You see this young man in the center of the slide with the big, huge gash in his head, who also was part of the Summer Freedom Project and was beaten by several segregationists. So the Voting Rights Act, it came about long before 1965. And that's one of the reasons why I set the book in 1964, because it was the work prior to that, prior to the Voting Rights Act, that really launched that legislation, and work by civil rights activists like Medgar Evers and so forth. But what really drew attention to, the horrific things going on in the South was the murder of these three young college students. They were in a small kind of town right outside of Jackson, Mississippi, and had gone out for the day to meet with rural families, trying to bring them in and get them to agree to sign up to vote. And then they went missing. And that car that's there, the picture of the car, is the actual station wagon that they were driving. Their bodies were found in a shallow grave about a month after they went missing, and that car was found at the bottom of a lake, a river. But their deaths actually put a light, it kind of illuminated the horror of what was going on when Black people simply were trying to register to vote, because this told people, it was, it then went all across news stations all over the country, and it told people the devastation that was really going on. And, of course, the intention was never to have anyone lose their life, but the Summer Freedom Project initiative um, kind of accomplished what it had set out to do, which was to illuminate what was going on in the South. Um, Now my book has it's told in three different points of view. You have the two first person views of the sisters Marigold and Violet, but also the third point of view, which is third person close, is of Mercer Buggs, who is the guy who is chasing the two sisters. And so, as I mentioned at the top of this conversation, one of the sisters takes off running to Cleveland because, as most people did, as my parents believed, well, we'll get out of the South because the South is so segregated. Things will be so much better up north. But what a lot of people discovered, just as my parents did, that things weren't exactly the nirvana that they thought it would be in the North. And that actually, while some areas the racism wasn't quite as blatant, they still felt a lot of segregation, particularly in housing, in jobs. And as you see here, this article says Cops Stand Idle as Mob Stones Negroes. This occurred in Cleveland and occurred probably about 5 minutes away from where my parents lived at the time. And so people who actually moved north seeking, this kind of holy grail of equality were sorely disappointed when they arrived. So this is just kind of, some of the research I did because I knew that I wanted to set the book in these two different places so that I could show the comparison between the North and the South, and maybe the not so subtle comparison, which was that in many ways they were still somewhat alike. So when I knew that I wanted to set the book in 1964, I always set out to write a story that's first and foremost entertaining. Like I said, if I ask people to spend 20, $30 for a book, they ought to get some entertainment value out of it as well. And for me, that also meant taking the book, creating authenticity, not only across the story that I was telling, kind of the story of the civil rights movement, but also what the people were like as well, so that my characters also came off as authentic, right? And so for me, that meant I wanted to know, what were people wearing in in 1964. Um, and I thought I came across this, I thought it was so interesting. If you look on the left-hand side, and these two ladies, there's one in a polka dot dress and one in a floral, and it says only $5.90 each. And I thought, oh my gosh, times have changed. You could get a dress for $6. I relied, in addition to wanting to know the fashions, I relied on some family members. So the picture that's up in the top right-hand corner where the gentleman has all the ladies, the lady who is on the far left is my mom's cousin. And then the picture with the three handsome young men standing in the living room, that's the living room of my parents' house. And the gentleman in the middle is actually my brother, my older brother. And the gentleman next to him in the yellow vest is my brother-in-law. He was married to my sister. So I relied on family members to the extent that they could provide helpful information about what it was like to live during this time. What'd you wear? What were you eating? What were you doing? What kind of parties were you going to? Because I wanted to incorporate all of that into this story. The other thing I relied on too was music, right? I think that this was like a classic time for music, the 1960s. And um, not only did I include some references to music in the story, but what I would do as I was writing the story was actually listen to playlists of 1960s music. And it just took me to that place, which helped me to write the story. At the beginning of the book, I reference a Patsy Cline song. And um, as my character, Violet, the sister who takes off running first, um, as she is running, she hears this Patsy Cline song on the radio. And she thinks about that song in relation to her life. I won't spoil it in case you decide to read the book, but it was little ways like that that I would drop in things about music and the time period that help not only lend authenticity to the book, but also help to um, kind of explain who the character was, so to speak. So that was a fun part of the research because I got to tell you, some of that stuff that I was researching at the beginning, and some of those pictures I showed you were those were tough research days when I was researching the violence of the civil rights movement. So this was kind of the fun side. I read tons and tons and tons of magazines. And again, I always give a shout out to the Auburn Avenue Research Library because this was part of that trove that they opened up for me. Magazines like Ebony, Jet, Life, Tan, Time, and read these articles throughout the 60s so that I could kind of follow along what was happening not only in Jackson, Mississippi, but what was happening in this country, in other parts of this country, what was happening in other parts of the world, for example, so that I could frame this story in a way that, like I said, was not only authentic, but also extrapolated and explained who my characters were as well. The other thing that reading magazines from that time period offered, uh, it gave me an opportunity to hear how people talked, how they sounded, right? Because people talked very differently back in 1964 than they talk today. And so I was able to hear the kinds of things they said, the colloquialisms, the phrases, and things like that, that I would drop into the book as well. So this is one of my favorite stories to talk about in relation to this book. Everybody knows the fabulous, fantastic hero that Hank Philippi Ryan is. She is this phenomenal writer. If you don't know who she is, you've got to come out of your mystery cave. But she is this phenomenal writer who's written all these bestsellers. Well, after my first book came out, she interviewed me on her podcast. And as we had wrapped up and finished, and we are about to part ways, and she said, "So what are you working on next?" And so I tell her about Anywhere You Run. And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm writing about these two sisters who, are involved in, civil rights movement, 1964, Mississippi." And she goes, really? And she says, "You know what? You need to talk to my husband because my husband was in Mississippi, and I believe it was Jackson, Mississippi in 1964." And it was like, oh, okay. Well, Hank Ryan offers me the opportunity to talk to somebody who's going to give me some free research. I'm in, right? So she connects me with Jonathan Shapiro, who is her husband. And we get on the phone and I give him the premise of my book. And I said, yeah. And so, the book takes place during the Summer Freedom Project. And he goes, oh, I was a lawyer for the Summer Freedom Project. I was like, what? It's like, so literally, I had, history right here in my hand or on the phone, so to speak. And I could have talked to this man for hours. He had wonderful stories. Um, there's a part in the book where I describe the offices where the lawyers worked for the Summer Freedom Project. Thank you, Jonathan Shapiro, right? Because he described what that office looked like. He described the little car that they used to tool around the city and that was parked behind the building. And so I had all of this, and I always say, when you are doing, the thing that you were supposed to be doing, that, God, the universe, the higher beings always seem to put the right people in your path. And I believe that that's what happened. In this case, he was so very helpful. So I am forever in debt to Hank and Jonathan for that. So, one last thing I thought was really pretty cool as I was going through this process. So, I had, written the book. We gone through the editing process. We were about to send it off for, I think, copy edits. And my editor says, hey, what do you want to see on the cover of the book? And one of the things that I had asked, because I've been very fortunate, my publisher, my editor, they give me some input into the book covers. And so with my debut novel, they were like, what do you want to see on the cover? And I was like, I want to see a Black woman on the cover. I see a lot of thriller books, but I don't see a lot of thriller books with Black women on the cover. And I don't mean like a cartoon or caricature or drawing. I want to see an actual face, a picture of a face. And so they gave me that in all her little secrets. And so when she asked me about this book cover, I was like, oh, if we could replicate the same thing, that would be great. So she kind of toddles off. She goes away and she calls me back a couple weeks later and she's like, we can't really find the right kind of picture, something that would really encapsulate these two sisters. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to do a photo shoot to come up with the book cover. And I was just aghast. It was like, wait, what? And so this is what they did. I think what the love doesn't seem to be anyone around. I think what the love now, the beating of our hearts is the only sign. Got to what was if they ever knew that so we're doesn't seem to be anyone around. I think we're alone now. The beating of our hearts is that not the coolest thing? I was just flabbergasted. Because what they did is they actually like listen, they took those characters that I had created. And I haven't given you a good enough description, but Violet is the one in black. She's very sassy. She's very much, I'm my own person, very beautiful. And Marigold is her sister, the good girl. or so to speak. But they truly encapsulated who those characters were in the cover. And I just thought, for one, I'd never known what gone into a book cover before. And I saw this and I was just like, whoa, that is pretty cool. Oops. It's going. So that is kind of how Anywhere You Run came to be, kind of what my thinking process was. I hope you guys will stay in touch with me. These are all the ways that you can reach out, follow me, send me questions. I'm always here. Um, so with that, I will turn it and open it up now for questions. Let me stop sharing this.
Wanda, thank you so much. That was really incredible. I have to say, like, I feel like I learned so much just about, well, certainly about the issue, but I had read the book,
Mhm.
obviously, and I loved the book.
Thanks.
Um, really loved the book. It's funny because I think you really gave away sort of a secret here,
Ever?
which is that you gave away a secret, which is, you really have to go to the sources, right?
Mm,
We can't just Google,
right.
right? When we're doing our historical stuff, like you got you know, the way that you immersed yourself with the magazines, which I think is the biggest secret tip. That's like the special sauce for me. Whenever
Mhm.
I'm writing historical, I go right to uh, like not just the music or the TV shows, I go right to the magazines because they have the
Mm,
ads. You're right. They have
exactly.
all the language
Mhm.
that people are using. So that's incredible. And I remember those magazines.
Mhm.
Like I remember them being, when you'd go to a newsstand and they were all the magazines were at the newsstand.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Ebony and Jet were always across our coffee table in the living room. My mother had subscriptions, so yeah.
yeah, like remember subscriptions?
Yeah, I remember subscriptions.
But yeah, I mean the thing that I just think is so incredible about Anywhere You Run is that you're in love with these characters.
Mhm.
When as a reader, you just fall in love with these two characters. But it's because of it's not just because of what they're going through, it's because who they are.
Mm.
And it's like you've just really encapsulated that backdrop. And now seeing all the work that you put into it, I can understand why it wasn't, you know, you didn't have to worry about taking the reader along. I mean, you bring them right in, but it's all that work that you do that it just makes it so incredible. So thank you for sharing those kind of like secrets with us.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
All right, so there are a couple questions
Mhm.
that they wanted a couple of people wanted to ask. Um, let's see. How do you balance truth and fact and emotional accuracy in telling your story when writing about a historical period?
Mm, that is a good question. So here is kind of my rule of thumb. Sometimes I break it, sometimes I don't. If it is something that I think will resonate with the reader personally, I try to make it as accurate as possible. So, for example, um, locations, okay, streets, things like that. If I'm talking about a town, like a real town where something actually happened, I want to make sure that those streets are as accurate as possible because people who are familiar with that, they're going to be the ones that read, they'll send me an email and go, such street as that. That didn't happen that way. So if it's something that's going to resonate with people personally, I try to make sure that that's as accurate as possible. Now, the flip side of that is if I am going to do something bad or terrible, for example, um, to someone in this particular location, for example, if I say something, I didn't say this in the book, but if I were going to write something like, oh yeah, Birdie Lane is a street where hundreds of people, get robbed or whatever. I'm probably going to make Birdie Lane up. That's going to be a fictional street. I'm not going to use a real street name for that because um, I don't want to assail or, make somebody feel bad for their particular area. I remember my first book, I had a small town that the protagonist was from. She was from this small town called Chillicothe, Georgia. Well, there's no such place as Chillicothe, Georgia. And the reason why I did that is because some really horrible things happened in Chillicothe, Georgia. And I didn't want anybody to say, hey, we're not like that. Now, Chillicothe was actually based on a real town, a real small town here in Georgia, but I changed the name because I didn't want anybody who was from that town to feel like I had, disparaged their hometown. So you usually have to kind of gauge it, but I try to make sure that first and foremost, if I'm telling something historical, I want it to be as accurate as possible, um, as close to the truth as possible. But there are things that I kind of fidge and fudge around with, the way people interact, in a certain location or street name or something like that. Because the whole idea, and this is something that I always have to tell myself when I'm writing any book, historical or any genre, I don't want to take the reader out of the story, right? So when I'm writing and I'm telling the story, I don't ever want the reader to read along and go, that doesn't happen like that. Or if I do change something, they'll be like, is that right? Well, they're so engrossed in the story, they don't care, right? So that's kind of how I gauge it. I hope that answers your question.
And then there was a question about original sources, but your story about Jonathan Shapiro kind of answered that one. But um, the second half of the question is, do you visit actual locations or do you just do research on the locations?
I do um, research by going to the actual places. Excuse me. Like for example, I told you about that little small town. I went there several times because I really needed to get that one right so that I could flip it and change it. Um, because I didn't want to describe like what the gas station on the corner exactly looked like, because then I didn't want people to put it together. With this book, Anywhere You Run, the hardest part for me was not so much like Jackson, Mississippi, but what was Jackson, Mississippi? What did it look like in 1964? Because, of course, it's changed dramatically. There's a portion in the book where Violet is running from Jackson and then she goes to Birmingham. Um, and I needed to know, like, what did downtown Birmingham look like because the car she was in was pulling into downtown Birmingham. Well, when I went to Birmingham doesn't have like the same Greyhound bus station or any of that stuff anymore, right? So then I had to go to sources where I could find pictures, I could find maps and things that would show me like what, for example, Birmingham looked like in 1964, where, the mayor's office was located in Jackson, Mississippi in 1964. So those kinds of things, yeah. I When I can't find them in today's like real sources, then I have to go back to the research.
Um, Vincent had another question, which I think was kind of interesting, which is, do you tend to imbue your characters with traits from people that you know, or do you try to stay away from that? Because your characters are so real. That's the thing. And I think
Oh,
that's inevitably going to be a question when you create these characters that really are so real. And by the way, the villain was chilling, but also had, but also, he wasn't a caricature.
yeah. You.
He was a person. So it's like, but I mean, I hope you don't know anyone that villainous, but even though we might see it on the news every day these days,
Thank you for that.
but
So, so Vincent, you got me. So here's the thing. I'll take the second part of that first. With the character Mercer Buggs, who is the villain in Anywhere You Run, um, I'll tell you the best compliment I ever got. about that book was from my husband, and he read a draft, and we went outside. We were walking one evening, and I said, "So, what'd you think?" And he said, "I gotta tell you, I got mixed feelings about Mercer." He said, "I've never read a book where I wanted to feel sorry for the villain." And I thought,
Mm.
okay, I'll take that, right? Um, the first part of the question, do I base them on people? So here's my trick. And then I'll tell you a funny story. I do tend to base my characters on real people. The villains, however, I have to take them and make them a mishmash of people that I've either interacted with, I've known, somebody has told me about. Because here's the thing with villains, you know, everybody's not all evil, everybody's not all good. And when I am creating a bad guy, I try to make sure that I imbue them with some characteristic that whether I might find it, you know, palatable or not, somebody might, if that makes any sense, right? Because that villain is somebody's brother or somebody's husband or, somebody's father. And so at some point in their life, somebody has looked at that villain character and thought, oh, he's a great guy, or, he's a great dad, or whatever. With my first book, All Her Little Secrets, there's a really bad character in that book. And I did base him on somebody that I had worked with when I was practicing law, right? So I'm doing a book event and I look into the audience and that person is sitting in the audience. And I'm like, oh my God, oh my
No.
God, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So, I keep talking, I'm being interviewed, I keep talking. And I think surely they're going to just leave. No, I look at the end of the book signing line and they're standing in line. And I'm like, hi, okay, so what am I going to say, right? The person comes up to me and says, oh my gosh, that book is so good. And wow, I'm so proud of you, and blah, blah, blah. And that character, that Jonathan guy, oh my gosh, he was awful. He didn't even recognize himself.
Ooh.
So the moral of that story is I think sometimes if you base them on characters, some people are so not self-aware that they might not even recognize it.
That is historical, but it's also someone said, I read somewhere once an author saying that, most villains don't realize they're the villain.
Right, exactly. They're
Right.
the hero in their
They're
story.
right. In their story, they're the hero. So, and I think that's so, boy, you did your job, right? Because this
Didn't
guy
even,
didn't even know
the guy was awful. It's like, yeah, that guy was awful.
that.
He did a really good job with that.
Yeah, he sucked.
Yeah, he's the worst.
Oh, that's really funny. That's a good one. Um, let's see. I think we have time for just one or two more questions. So this is kind of a like inside baseball kind of a question.
Mhm.
Um, asking you about, do you get to use the services of a fact checker? In other words, once you write it, does your publisher, kind of go through it too for the fact checking, or is that kind of all on the author to get it right?
Here's what I do. I try to make sure I check all my facts before I send it in for the final, right? And I tell my editor, you know, here's what I think is the case or whatever. And then they do have an editor at the publishing house who will go back and check facts, dates, places, historical references, all of that. The publisher, I'm traditionally published. And so they have an editor that specifically checks for that. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's still good to know, right?
Yeah,
that you have
e-
that sort of a little bit of that safety net, even though it's really all on
exactly.
you, right?
And I usually try and do it anyway because I just don't want to get it wrong because as I'm writing the story, I want to make sure that I'm not writing something that's incorrect and it might impact something later in the story. So I try and make sure all my facts are
Right.
correct.
And like you say, like you said, you don't want to take anyone out of the book.
Exactly.
Right. So you have written this incredible historical, your first book with Elise. I loved that. That was a contemporary. Do you find it easier to write about issues like, um, the Jim Crow South and civil rights through that historical lens, rather than taking it like writing a contemporary book about all the, voting issues that are happening today?
So here's the thing, Kate. When I came up with the idea, like I told you, we had just come through this political cycle. I actually wanted to do a book that talked about kind of voting rights in this country and contemporary set, but I couldn't find an entryway into the story. And then when I started to do research about the Voting Rights Act and the people, the icons who were instrumental in getting that legislation passed, that's when I came across the story of, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Now, of course, I had heard about them in school and so forth. And I thought, okay, this might give me an entryway into it. I don't think when I initially had the idea, I was like, yeah, I'm going to write a historical. I thought I was going to write a book about voting rights. Um, and it just kind of came about that way. For me, though, I got to tell you, I always listen to people when they read my bio, and, it just sounds magical, right? Well, first and foremost, it took me, almost 15 years to even get published for the very first time. And then all those wonderful accolades and the awards you see behind me, it's blood, sweat, and tears. Every single book for me is hard. I am starting now to develop the storyline for I guess it'll be my fifth book. Um, and I come to the computer and I'm like, what are words? I mean, like every book is super, super hard. And I don't know whether it's because I put the pressure on myself because I want to create a story that is riveting and entertaining and educational and all these things, or whether it's just because I come to each story, like a newborn. I'm an open and clean slate that says, universe hit me with the story. How do I tell this? And so for me, every book is hard.
I mean, that's inspiring and beautiful and aspirational. And I
It
think
does
it's really
not
good
get
advice.
any easier.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's good for writers to hear that,
Mhm.
right? Because if you're doing your job right, maybe it shouldn't be easy.
Yeah,
I don't know. I'm not
maybe.
sure. Um, Wanda, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was just incredible. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you for all your great questions in the chat. I'm not making this up. Hank Philippi Ryan is actually going to be our next guest in December.
Give her
So that's a
all
little
my
that's a
love.
little synergy there, a little
That is, tell
little
her how much
serendipity.
I adore her.
I will, of course. I know that it's mutual. And yeah, thank you just so much for joining us tonight.
Thank
Thank you
you
for
all.
making yourself so accessible with giving your information to everybody. And thank you everyone for
And
joining us.
if I did not get to someone's question, please just reach out to me through my website, wandamorriswrites.com, and just say, I was at the MWA meeting. I had a question. I'm happy to respond. Thank you all so very much. Thank you for all your support. Kate, I adore you. Thank you. Mwah.
It's so
Angela,
mutual,
I
Wanda.
adore
Thank you
you.
so
Mwah.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Happy writing.